you very much for the lecture. We are going now to the second speaker, which is also continuing the Maimonidean ideas through the lens of Abu Rafia now to Maimonides himself. I'm delighted to invite Dr. Tali Loewenthal, which is the lecturer in the Jewish spirituality at the University College of London and received his PhD in '81. He is the author of the Communicating the Infinite, the Emergence of the Chabad School, and many scholarly articles on Hasidism. He also directs the Chabad Research Unit in the Educational Organization and teaches religious studies in the Lubavitch Senior Girls School in London.
Yeah. Was there a handout?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there is a handout here. Please, if somebody, yeah. Oh, we need also.
No.
Thank you. Everybody?
Okay, right. So this paper, I hope to try to present some points of connection between the thought of the Rambam and that of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rebbe Menachem Schneerson, whom I'm going to call Ramash, which is what he was called in the 1940s, and it's somehow the most convenient way to address him. Most of the points that I'm going to mention, I think for a large proportion of the people here, are very obvious. However, I hope that one or two points will be unexpected. So, the obvious points concern the way Ramash adopted Maimonides as a paradigm for Chabad Hasidism today. The more hidden elements concern Ramash being influenced and assimilate for himself topics such as natural law and, in a more general sense, the naturalism of Maimonides in the way that it's perceived today. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to convince anyone about this, but this is what I want to try to share with you, these perceptions. Now, I'm sitting next just with Moshe Idel, who of course wrote a famous article on Maimonides and Kabbalah, but a very important book about Chabad and Maimonides, and particularly the Ramash, he calls it the Rambam, and Maimonides, was written by Dr. Yaakov Gottlieb. It was his PhD under Dov Schwartz, and it's a very full, nuanced work discussing Chabad and the Rambam. The English title, which is close to the PhD title, is Rationalism in Hasidic Attire, Chabad's harmonistic approach to Maimonides, right? So the harmonism is exactly the issue that he is putting at the forefront. And he and I were actually working at the same time. He was writing a whole book. I was writing an article on the image of Maimonides and Chabad Hasidism, which came out in Carlos Frankel's Traditions of Maimonideism, which was the proceedings of a conference which UCL, University College, held, as many places, held conferences in 2004, the 800 years from the Rambam's passing away. Now, Gottlieb sees Ramash confronting the Rambam in several different ways. And a very interesting aspect, apart from appropriating Maimonides, presenting him as a paradigm, using him to communicate Chabad values, but that he felt that there was actually an awareness of Maimonidean discourse. And in philosophic terms, quite apart from what we expect, that Maimonides is being in some way adapted, Ramash wrote about Rashi in such a way that you discover Hasidic teachings in Rashi, and which is all part of a spiritual process. But I'm trying to look for this different level, where there is a sensitivity to the philosophy, as it were, the Maimonist discourse. And Gottlieb finds that, and he shows at different points. I'm not going to repeat his work, but he does find that element in Ramash, which I find an interesting thing, and then will enable me to take a little bit further. But there's one element which I am taking from Gottlieb, because I believe it's very valuable. Now, of course, we have to consider, when we're talking about the Rambam, the many different perspectives on the Rambam. Is there one Rambam, or two, or more? According to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the saintly halachic scholar who wrote the Mishneh Torah could not be the same as the person who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed. And Moshe has already mentioned the Vilna Gaon speaking about the cursed philosophy of Philosophia Arura, which, in his view, put the Rambam wrong on a halachic issue about charming a scorpion bite. So, however, at the same time, we've got this creeping terminology coming from the Rambam. So one of the approaches is focusing on the halachic Rambam of Mishneh Torah, the Perush on the Mishnayot, try to ignore the guide. Other approaches include the guides, and there are two directions here. One is to understand the guide as being written as a subterfuge to reach Jews involved in philosophy and help them relate to Judaism. That's how Nachmanides understood it. In his defense, when he was defending Maimonides against attacks in the Maimonides controversy, the posthumous Maimonides controversy. But then there's another way of looking at the guide, that the guide to of the perplexed is actually what Maimonides really meant, and this is his real message to the world. So then comes the question, what kind of message is he presenting? Is it a purely Aristotelian message, as transmitted by the Arabic philosophers to whose works Maimonides had full access? Or is it a unique message of intellectualist Jewish spirituality? Now, Leo Strauss. Now, the question is, to what extent can we expect the Hasidic Rebbe, Ramash, to have access to this kind of discussion? Leo Strauss is famous for his focus on the Rambam of the Guide as the real or only Rambam, presenting a strong Aristotelian message, quite at variance from his halachic image in Mishneh Torah. By contrast, Hartman, Twersky, and the great Yemenite scholar of the Rambam, Rabbi Yosef Kapach, or Kafi, see the Rambam as a unified figure in whose writings halacha and philosophy merge. Further, George Vaida and David Blumenthal of Emory University, unfortunately neither of these are mentioned by Gottlieb, see the Rambam as expounding an intellectualist form of spirituality in which rationalism and intense erotic love for the divine, a veritable passion for God, are one. Now, did Ramash have any access to this kind of discussion? Yes, you have a Hasidic Rebbe. Of course, the life of the Ramash was very unconventional for a Hasidic Rebbe. Obviously, he had access with all the traditional arguments about the Rambam and the Guide, which are in standard Hebrew works. Fine. What about modern scholarship? Leo Strauss, this fascinating figure, a man of tremendous energy and power, he was in Berlin at the same time as Ramash, around 1930. They had a friend in common, Alexander Altman. Well, whether that meant that they actually met each other, I don't know. I heard via Shimon Abramsky, alav shalom, who was very close with Altman, that I met Altman, but I didn't have any conversations with him. But Shimon was very close with him. And Shimon told me that Ramash, Altman, and Soloveitchik would meet together in each other's apartments and discuss things. And according to Shimon's account, the main interest of Ramash was philosophy. Now, if Altman also had a close friend, Leo Strauss, who was around at the same time, he might have also been at one of those dinner parties, tea parties, whatever they were. Then we have later, in the 1930s, Ramash was in Paris. He was studying electrical engineering for a diploma, but he was also auditing lectures at the Sorbonne and other institutions. Could he have met George Weider? Weider had studied in a rabbinical seminary in Hungary, then moved to Paris in 1928. In the 1930s, he lectured on Bible and theology at the Séminaire Israélite de France, and despite his youth, was on the editorial committee of the Revue des Études Juives, with an interest in Kabbalah as well as Islamic studies and Maimonides. I leave this as an open question. I don't know. However, what we do know is that a number of Chabad Hasidim were academic philosophers, such as the late Rabbi Dr. Emanuel Shocher, who had close contact with Ramash over many years. Not just, he wasn't the Chassid who comes and receives a blessing from the Rebbe or something like that. He was a person who would sit with the Rebbe and they would discuss it. And at one point he told me the Rebbe didn't like the Moira Nebuchim. Didn't like it at all.
Didn't like what?
The Moira Nebuchim, the guide for the perplexed. Now, Shochet did. This is my understanding. And he would give talks in a kind of, public outreach, kind of, communal situation where there was this strong Moira Nebuchim element in his communication, sometimes shocking the audience. So I'm wondering, whether Ramash not liking Moira Nebuchim was trying to get him away from Moira Nebuchim. But anyway, that's what he told me. He's unfortunately passed away, and I would like to try to find out more about what he thought about it or what he knew. Then there's another figure, thankfully he's still alive, Dr. Yitzchak Bloch. He's his field here, a lecturer in the field of philosophy in London, Ontario, I think. And his field was Aristotle. And the Rebbe kept encouraging him to write a book on Aristotle, but he never did, as far as I know. Maybe he's got it in. And also, Ramash was very close with Rabbi Yosef Kapach, whom I mentioned before, and this eminent Yemenite scholar who retranslated the guide into Hebrew with his own commentary, who retranslated the commentary on the Mishnah, produced a new critical edition of the Hebrew of Mishnah Torah. So this figure, I hear that as soon as he brought out a book, it would be sent to Ramash. And Ramash was very concerned to receive Kapach's books. Now, looking at the indexes to the published teachings of Ramash, Likutei Sichot, yes, there's 2 volumes of indexes to these works. There are 39 volumes of Likutei Sichot, and there are 2 volumes of indexes. One sees copious references to Mishneh Torah. I would say every single halacha of the 83 halachot of Mishneh Torah is mentioned somewhere in the Likutei Sichot, and perhaps many times. There are also citations of most other works by Maimonides, not the medical works so much, although even those do come in for references occasionally. But I counted 60 of the chapters of the guide, that's about a third of the book, are referenced in some way in Likutei Sichot, according to the index. It's points from 60 different chapters. So that suggests, if we are looking at this sort of like social environment that he was in during his university years, and his actual reading of the guide, and even the books in his study, which one is able to visit in New York. There's a set of Encyclopedia Judaica, which has a modern article on the Rambam. He's a Hasidic Rebbe, but he has access through people and through his youthful time in Berlin and Paris, and to be able to have access to the different ways that people were thinking about the Rambam. Now, what did he make of it? Well, we have the whole question of the relationship of the Rambam to mysticism, and Ramash's friend Alexander Altman wrote an article about Maimonides and Jewish mysticism published in 1936. And although Altman's final view was that Maimonides was not a mystic, he presented a lot of interesting evidence, including speaking strongly about Avraham Abulafia and the way that, as Moshe has also written, and has spoken about here, that the guide can be read as a mystical, as a mystical manual leading to intense spiritual experience. So, in fact, quoting Moshe, he wrote that in terms of the ecstatic Kabbalah, Maimonides' guide can be regarded as a principal catalyzer of Jewish mysticism. Okay, I got it here. So, now, although Moshe pointed out that this approach to the guide utilized techniques such as repeated recitation of divine names, which Maimonides himself opposed. Right? So these are the paradoxes. Maimonides opposed people visiting graves. His grave in Tiberias is one of the most visited Jewish graves. So these are the paradoxes of history. Another interesting perspective which Moshe provides is the Reb Chaim Vital believed he had a shaychut v'kurva with Maimonides, a special relationship. And Moshe suggested Reb Chaim Vital might have thought he was giving a tikkun to the rationalism of the Rambam and also of Rabbi Vidal of Toulouse, the author of the Maggid Mishnah, of whom Reb Chaim Vital thought he was a Gilgul, an incarnation. So, well, however, for many Kabbalists, it was clear that Maimonides' writings were not in the Kabbalistic spirit, as seen in the tradition that at the end of his life, he changed his views in favor of Kabbalah. Sholem has written about that. But this perspective on Maimonides was, I would say, was not the perspective espoused by Ramash, although he mentions its existence. Ramash's view, he saw Maimonides as an overtly spiritual teacher throughout his career. And the issue of him being a Mukubal or not a Mukubal is in a sense irrelevant to that perspective. Now, what's the relationship of the Rambam with Hasidism? Moshe has just spoken very interestingly, and Yaakov Dinstag wrote a discussion of early Hasidic treatment of Maimonides in the Guide, where there's direct quotations from the Guide. My old teacher, Yosef Weiss, Alav Shalom, he went further. He saw the Guide 351 as a direct source of the Hasidic concept of dveikut when doing mundane activities. When to do dveikut, to be in a state of dveikut when you're doing something spiritual like prayer, okay, but what about when you're going shopping in the supermarket? So the Rambam presents a way of being with one hand, as it were, you're doing some ordinary activity, and at the other, you are at the same time in a state of dveikut. And Weiss saw the Guide as the source for this important Hasidic concept. And this is really the kind of thing that I'm trying to look for in this paper, the influences which are coming from the Rambam into Hasidism, into Chabad, and into the Ramash's own teachings. Now we come to Hasidism, to Chabad itself, and a number of scholars, including Foxbrunner, particularly in his book on Reb Shneur Zalman de Vladi, have suggested that the contemplative system taught by Rashaz by Reb Shneur Zalman, is strongly influenced by the Rambam. Now, let's see if we can find in this wonderful set of sources. Right, okay, we've got it. Look, right at the beginning. There's the Rambam Hilchot Yesodei Torah, Perik Beit, Halacha Beit, and Tanya Likutei Amarim, Chedek Aleph, Perik Gimel. Okay, so you've got them in front of you. I'm going to read them, as it were, just to focus us. בשעה שיתבונן האדם במעשיו וברואיו הנפלאים הגדולים, ויראה מהם חוכמתו, שאין לה ערך ולא קץ, מיד הוא אוהב ומשבח ומפאר ומתאווה תאווה גדולה לדע השם הגדול, כמו שאמר דוד, צמא נפשי לאלוקים לקהל חי. וכשמחשב בדברים האלו עצמם, מיד הוא נכתע לאחוריו ומפחד ויודע שהוא בריאה קטנה שפלה אפלה עומדת בדעת קלה מועטה לפני תמים דעות. Okay, so that is from the Rambam. Now let's look at what I think of as a passage makbil מאוד from the Tanya Perek Gimel. כשמתבונן ומעמיק מאוד בגדולת השם, איך הוא ממלא כל העלמין וסובב כל העלמין וכולי כמה כלא חשיב, נולדה ונתעוררה מידת יראת הרוממות במוחו ומחשבתו, ליראה ולהתבושש מגדולתו יתברך, שאין לה סוף ותכלית, ופחד השם בליבו, ושוב יתלהב ליבו באהבה עזה כריש באש בחשיקה, ובחפצה ותשוקה ונפש שוקקה, לגדולת אין סוף ברוך הוא, etc. Now, to me, it is interesting. I see a hakbala. Could you indicate whether you see a similarity? If you do see a similarity, put up 4 fingers, and if you don't see a similarity, could you put up 1 finger so that I get some kind of whether anyone is with you. There's a 4 finger over there, 4 fingers over there. Okay, good. Okay, so we're on the same page, but you only see 1. You don't see it. You don't see the hakbala. Okay, right. Okay, good. Fair enough. What I find interesting is the differences. The differences are that the Rambam is speaking about looking at nature, looking at existence in its Aristotelian form of intelligences and spheres, and which to the Rambam was physics. That was the reality of existence. Whereas Rabbi Shneur Zalman is looking at Mamale Kol Almin and Sovet Kol Almin, which are theosophic concepts. But the interesting problem is that the Aristotelian worldview, as Moshe has just said, was adopted and assimilated into the Kabbalah so that it actually becomes holy. So much so that I had heard it said that Rabbi Kapach believes, there is this tradition of Orthodox Jews reading things in the Beit HaKisei. And he said, you can't read Aristotle in the Beit HaKisei because it's all holy. So that's the assuming that some of you at least are with me on this idea of a Maimonidean approach to Hitbonenut with differences. Let's move on. 2 generations later, after Rabbi Shneur Zalman, there's the Tzemach Tzedek, wrote Sefer HaChakirah, the third Chabad Rebbe, which discusses a lot the Rambam and the Rasag. I'm not going to discuss that here. Gottlieb has a chapter on it, which is very interesting, but it's outside our present discussion. But what I am going to focus on is the Rebbe Rashab. I'm going to focus on the Rebbe Rashab. Okay, thank you. Rashab was very interesting. In a talk that he gave, he claimed that the disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich studied the guide, which is a claim that's supported, if you like, by Dienstag and Weiss. He also presented a Hasidic view on the difference between the Rambam and Aristotle. Okay, it's you would expect a Hasidic Rebbe, if he's talking about the Rambam in a positive way, he's going to try and show what is different between the Rambam and Aristotle. He says the Rambam puts the point of emunah at the center, and then he draws the circle of discursive, of seichel, of reason, whereas Aristotle has the circle of reason. He doesn't know where the center is going to be. It can go anywhere. All right, so thus Maimonidean rationalism is being adopted into Orthodox Judaism, but that's not what I'm trying to look for. However, there's something more interesting for our present discussion. On Simchat Torah in the autumn of 1904, Rashab compared the 4 who entered Pardes in Chagigah with Maimonides. According to the Rashab, these 4 entering Pardes, entering a deep mystical experience, did so by means of divine names, but Maimonides was able to reach the same level just by means of pure intellect. So in other words, there is an ecstatic mode of divine names being said or repeated or some kind of technique which enabled them to enter the world of Yetzirah, and the Rambam could enter the world of Yetzirah simply through Seichel. Now then comes a very interesting step where the Rashab, Reb Sholem Daber, takes this idea and applies it to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, by which I understand he doesn't only mean Rabbi Shneur Zalman, he means himself as well, and says that through the use of seichel, of one's mind, exploring the philosophic teachings, as Moshe has explained, the philosophic teachings of Chabad, one is able to enter, in fact he says, not just the world of Yetzirah, the world of Atzilut. So what he is doing, he is using the Rambam, the idea of the rationalist, intellectualist, mystical approach of the Rambam as support for the distinguishing feature of particularly his own writing, these phenomenal ayin bet, these phenomenal long texts of Hasidic philosophical analysis, and he is justifying their spiritual power on the basis of Maimonides. It's a very interesting, adroit adaptation of thought, that he's using Maimonides to show how his own discourses have a mystical power beyond the use, which makes the use of divine names unnecessary, because just the fact of studying his intense discourses is going to lift you, he's saying, to the world of Atzilut. Now this is particularly germane for study of Ramash, because the Ramash's discourses are based on, very largely, are based on the teachings of Reb Shalom Dov Ber, particularly his extremely profound, long series of discourses in Ayin Beit, Samach Vav, these famous Hemsheichim, which are fascinating area, there was a conference about Ayin Beit in this series last year, also with Eli, and so I think that's a very interesting thing. It's not exactly an influence of the Rambam; it's the Rambam being used as giving a hechsher and demonstrating the spiritual power of what is being accomplished. Okay, so now let's come to the Ramash himself and the Rambam. It's instructive to look at a rather interesting document by a rabbi called Feitel Levin, who was educated in Brunwa, in the Chabad Yeshiva in Brunwa, where he was given the typical Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson atmosphere of Chassidut, and also his father, Alav Shalom, taught him. And then he came to 770, he came to New York, and had a kind of culture shock. And he's now a Rosh Kollel in Melbourne, very, very intellectual figure. And in order to deal with the culture shock, he wrote a book called Heaven on Earth. And he is shocked by the fact that what he was learning in Brunwa was how you, through meditative prayer, you enter some kind of like spiritual, otherworldly realm. And the Ramash's approach was dira batachtonim, to be here in this world. And in his analysis of this difference, almost trying to cope with this difference, his book had a great influence on someone called Max Cohen-Zadeh, who wrote a PhD, which unfortunately didn't get through, for technical reasons, about Ramash, and that influenced Elliot Wolfson in his book Open Secret. So it's from Heaven on Earth to Open Secret. We're talking about manuscript steps, so there are steps there. Now, one of the things that Feitel Levin does is he compares what Ramash is trying to do with what the Rambam is trying to do. And he says they're completely different. For the Rambam, the final goal is a spiritual realm, and for Ramash, it's in this world. And he puts this in like 5 or 6 different points. They're completely different. Now, this is true. But one must also point out that Levin has basically a traditional understanding of the Rambam's teaching. He doesn't mention, may not be aware, perhaps he is, of the naturalism aspect of the Rambam. That means the focus on the significance of the natural world as it is. And further, the teachings of Ramash were themselves developing in the time that Feitel was writing this book and thinking about it. That was becoming more and more defined. So let's proceed with care. First of all, let's have a clear anti-Maimonist statement by Ramash, which is in the 1940s. He wrote a long article called Kol Yisrael Yesh Lehem Chelek Le'olam Haba, which emphasizes that what is Olam Haba, Tchiyat HaMeitim B'Gufim, and Olam Haba as an ethereal realm is just, that's only a stage. the complete opposite of what the Rambam is saying. Of course, the Rambam himself had been criticized for his statements in the Chok Shuvah about Olam Haba, so lots of people disagreed with that. But it would seem that Ramash and the Rambam are two opposite sides of the arena. However, in Ramash's teachings as Rebbe, for example, in 1952, he starts, in one of his sichot, he talks about a mashal, a parable. And he cites the interesting discussion of parables in the introduction to the guide, as if it is a book, a kosher book, which is part of the reference works that a scholar uses in order to communicate something, and that's a pshat use of the guide. He's not interpreting it in a Chabad way, he's simply using it as kipshuto. Except, of course, we must understand that the guide, the Rambam says in his introduction to the guide, he's going to say things he doesn't really mean, so there's always the question, what is the pshat of the guide or not? Gottlieb tries to trace the evolution of the thought of Ramash about the Rambam. He interprets a letter by Ramash of 1957 which criticizes orthodox apologetics regarding science as a shaft aimed at the Rambam's apologetics. But later, in 1982, a letter by Ramash claims that the guide reveals godliness. So there's some kind of tahalich, there's a process over here. Gottlieb also quotes a letter by Ramash from 1963, where Ramash says, I always found difficult the idea which I heard from my father-in-law, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, that the Rambam was a Kabbalist. What a wonderful find, to find that letter. However, later in 1985, Ramash presents a rational way of explaining this. He says, the Rambam says in the introduction to Mishnah Torah that he read all the books of the Geonim. Now, among the books of the Geonim, there are some Kabbalistic works. So Ramash says, well, that shows he did read some Kabbalistic works. Okay, but around 1980, Ramash said he considered the guide a spiritual manual. He compares it to the Tanya, but with the difference, he claims, that the Tanya was written for everyone while the guide was compiled only for a small elite. We're going to hopefully touch on this question about elite. Now, Gottlieb makes the point that by the late 1980s, Ramash ceased any kind of criticism of the Rambam. He now presented him as if he were one of the chain of leaders of Chabad. That's Gottlieb's view, and I think that's people following the Sichot of the Rebbe, that seemed to be the path. An early indication of a serious focus on the Rambam by Ramash was a series of Hadranim. A Hadran is what you do when you finish a Masechta, you finish Shas. Suddenly, he began doing this on finishing Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah enters this realm. So in 1973, there was a Hadran of Mishneh Torah together with Masechet Ketubot, big Masechta, and so, sort of pads out the issue. In 1975, there was a Yud Tet Kislev Hadran on Mishneh Torah with a little Masechta, Tamid. So it's as if the Mishneh Torah is now filling the stream. And then Ramash was very interested in anniversaries. If one reads his letters that he was writing when it was 150 years from the passing of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, every single letter mentions this is the 150th year since the passing of Rabbi Shneur Zalman. Now, 1980 was 800 years since the completion of Mishneh Torah. And I believe that had an anniversary effect on the Rebbe. I suggest that. We get things such as in 1982, the picture of the Rambam's diagram of the menorah, this picture, which is in a manuscript in Oxford, in the Bodleian Library, in his Perush on the Mishnayot. And there, when it's talking about the menorah, that picture suddenly was adopted by Ramash. He had already shown an interesting graphics in the 1940s. He had a graphic made of the tablets of the law, the Luchot, making them rectangular, as it says in the Talmud, instead of with curved tops. And from the 1970s, there was a proliferation of the large Chabad public menorot, as described by Maya Balakirsky-Katz. But she notes the adoption by Ramash of the Rambam image, but doesn't explore further. I suggest it's really an important step in intensifying the focus on the Rambam. And also what happens in the early 1980s is Ramash's concern for teaching the 7 Noahide laws to Gentiles and the laws of kings, Malachim 8:10, is the Rambam's main, is Ramash's main source for this. And so there is another point where the Rambam is sort of coming in. Now, is it an influence of the Rambam, or is it Ramash using the Rambam? They're unique on both levels. All right, we're going to have to skip a lot of stuff. Let me get to the basic idea of natural law. Now, if we look, it's number 6 over here. Rambam Hilchot Avodot Kochavim, Perek Aleph, Halacha Gimel. It tells us there about Avraham Avinu and the way that Avraham Avinu discovered monotheism. He discovered monotheism all by himself. The Rambam leaves out the idea of God communicating with him. He simply, by the fact that he is looking at existence and considering who is moving the galgal, the sphere, he comes to the conclusion that there is God, and he communicates the existence of God to everyone around him. Now, this concept of natural law, in other words, just by looking at nature, there is law. The following text, Hitva'aduyot, from the Ramash, from the second day of Chag HaShavuot, 1987, there is a presentation of the idea that around the halakha, the strict halakha, there is a kind of a broader framework of seichel, and one has to operate within that broader framework as well. It is not enough to just say, well, this is what the halakha says, but you need the broader dimension of seichel as well, of reason. Now, as David pointed out to me very kindly, Reb Shimon Shkop writes about this in his introduction to Dinei Mammon of financial law, of commercial law, that there is a basic sense, a rational sense of mishpat, of law, and the halachot of the Torah are operating in a kind of a web within that, in a fascinating way. And if one were exploring this in more detail, that would have to be factored in, the Shimon Shkop, but certainly we have here a very, very intriguing element, and it's a rational dimension to Ramash, which I believe is an extremely important one in his presentation of what Judaism is about. And finally, we have the concept of, now the way that Ramash puts it, there's a sikha where he speaks about it, so it should be in this pack, but it's just a brief quotation. He says it on the 16th of Kislev in 1991, shortly before, a few months before he had the stroke, which he never recovered from. He said, and then he was at the height of this messianic teaching, vision that he was presenting. He said, open your eyes and you will see the presence of the divine. Now, if you can find Moreh Nevuchim, Chelek Aleph, it's text number 9, Chelek Aleph, chapter 54, this is what we're going to conclude on. Here, the Rambam is describing Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai, the most intimate moment of man with God in our Jewish history. And Moshe says to God, it's in italics because he put it in Hebrew in the text. Pinez puts the original Hebrew in italics. Show me now thy ways that I may know thee. So what's this show me now thy ways? So God says, if it continues here, hopefully, God says, I will show you all my goodness. And what is all his goodness? Oh, it doesn't continue, never mind. What is all, on the next page, what is all my goodness? Okay, 154, look at that. What is all my goodness? I will make all my goodness pass before you. And the goodness alludes to the display to him of all existing things of which it said, and God saw everything he'd made, and behold, it was very good. All my goodness is existence. Here we are. This existence is the divine goodness. Open your eyes and you will see it. Okay, do you see a hafala there? Do you see any correspondence there? If you see a correspondence, put up 4 fingers, and if you don't, put up 1. See, I teach in a school, so they teach us to get audience reaction. No hafala, but yes, you. Okay, look, some. All right, fine. Thank you very much.